So I'm hoping to provide a little bit of a historical introduction to the really important discussions people need to have today. We're at a particular moment in a shift within state regulation of AIDS service organizations that I think opens up major dangers for people, as well as perhaps possibilities for rethinking and trying to do things differently. I'm really glad that Alex mentioned that we're on Indigenous land. The talk I'm doing today, which is going to be really brief, and largely it's going to be flashing slides at you, so I hope to be known as the flasher at the conference. This talk is dedicated to Michael Smith, who is a dear friend of mine who died of AIDS-related conditions in 1991. He was an activist in AIDS Action Now. He helped to get some of the prison organizing going, prisoner rights organizing going that came out of AIDS Action Now and that connects to what Anne-Marie's going to be talking about. And he was also a fervent supporter of Indigenous struggles. So the entry point into this talk is a particular moment. Can people see the slides behind me, or should I move? You can see it? It's better this way? Okay. Is that all right for everyone else? Anyway, I wanted to use as an entry point a particular historical moment, and also the discovery by accident in Nova Scotia of this banner this summer of what happened in terms of a coming together of AIDS activists who received absolutely no state funding at all, and people who were at that point in time involved in what they would have described as community-based AIDS groups that were in the process of becoming AIDS service organizations. So it's really important for us in the AIDS Activist History Project that we're recovering not only historical memories, but also objects that help to provoke memories. So this banner was actually used at a conference in 1988 that AIDS Action Now decided to do some action around to try to provoke or incite people in community-based AIDS groups to also take action. So there was a Canadian AIDS Society conference, and it was followed by a Canadian conference on AIDS that had government officials and all sorts of professionals and medical people at it. And we used this banner to do a two-prong action at the very beginning of that conference. One was Greg Pavlich and myself unfurled this banner when the representative of JGAP spoke at the beginning of that conference. Happy Equals Death is obviously modeled on the ACT UP slogan, Silence Equals Death, and we were there to protest the inaction and neglect of the federal government. And at the same time, you probably can't see it very well up here, there was a die-in held outside the conference. The plan from AIDS Action Now's vantage point was to try to utilize this as an opportunity to bring AIDS activists together with community-based AIDS group people. And it actually worked out remarkably well.
Gary, could I just ask you to move the mic a little away from the mouth? You're much louder than Alex.
I actually probably can just talk. Can everyone hear? I've been known to be a human megaphone, so I'll just talk. It's probably more comfortable for me. So there's a lot of feedback there then. Anyway, so we had a protest the next day that managed to bring out 300 people into the streets. You can actually, thank you very much for doing the talk, but you don't have to hold it for the whole speech. If anyone else has things like this, the AIDS Activist History Project is very interested in collecting them, and they'll eventually go to places like the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. So we had a really successful action the next day of 300 people taking over the streets, marching by the Tory office, and at the end of that protest, we burned, and again you can't see it very well here, but Greg Pavlich was holding this, and we burned JGAP in effigy. This was actually a remarkably successful action. I should also point out that Michael Smith helped to make that effigy of JGAP. We learned a couple of weeks later that Brian Mulroney hauled JGAP into his office and actually challenged him about why people in the streets of Toronto were burning him in effigy, what was going on here. It was a remarkable example, I think, of the coming together, a new composition of struggle, for a moment anyway, of AIDS activists and people from community-based AIDS groups. And I think one of the things that we might want to be talking about today is, even though the type of AIDS activism that existed then is much weaker right now, is there a way of trying to recombine those different forces in the new context that we face? The withdrawal of consent to the Canadian government and to JGAP helped to create the preconditions for a new strategy, a strategy shift on the part of the Canadian state. It's really important for us to understand that it's our actions that actually provoke some of those things, that we can actually act to change things. Now, the major success of the so-called National AIDS Strategy was the Treatment Information Registry that eventually leads up to Katie. Also, there was a new strategy of consultation and partnership with community-based AIDS groups that obviously was better than a complete inaction and neglect, but also produced a whole series of problems and difficulties for people in AIDS groups. I'm starting here in this presentation from memory work, which is also what we're drawing upon in the AIDS Activist History Project. There are basically, during the period of time, I'm talking about two different waves of AIDS organizing. The first one is the wave that produces the AIDS community-based groups. In response to state neglect and inaction and the deaths of people, people within gay and lesbian communities form community-based AIDS groups, often drawing upon some of the insights from feminist health activism initially. I was one of the first 3 employees of the AIDS Committee of Toronto. I remember being in that office over there when it was a Kentucky Fried Chicken, and the joke among the staff was that we were secretly conducting a study as to whether consumption of Kentucky Fried Chicken, which our board of directors was really into, could actually lead to the acquisition of HIV infection. Because, I mean, that office was just saturated all the time with this horrible smell of Kentucky Fried Chicken. But just to point out a couple of things that I want to draw out of that experience of working for the AIDS Committee of Toronto, and I only worked for the AIDS Committee of Toronto for 6 months, was that we actually began to develop forms of safe-sex education and safe-sex organizing. And it's important to remember that. That came from the grassroots. It did not come from public health officials. It came from us. And that was really an important acquisition of that early organizing. But I also want to relay a couple of stories. I was involved in going to some of the early meetings of the ACT AIDS support group. And people would often go around at the beginning of those meetings and say what they did. I remember being at one of them, and everyone who spoke, aside from 2 individuals, had some sort of employment or medical or professional relationship to AIDS. And then there were 2 gay waiters who were there. They never came back. So you had processes of exclusion of people being organized out of AIDS groups. And I think that has an awful lot to do with class relations and a certain type of professionalization that organizes people out of AIDS groups that don't have those particular types of credentials. I was also given the responsibility within ACT of organizing liaison with the Haitian community, which took a long time to get a Haitian representative to actually come to a board of directors meeting. They were not particularly interested in meeting with a bunch of white, what they understood as white gay men, which was largely the case, but not entirely the case there. The unfortunate thing was that too many of the people on the board of directors of ACT, with their medical connections and public health connections, actually decided on that occasion to go after the representative of the Haitian community for not being properly educated about medical language and discourse, and actually ruptured that relationship. So there was actually a lot of racism going on there, but also a type of professionalization and tying into medical relations that actually led ACT to initially rupture the relationship that took so long to develop with individuals from the Haitian community who were actually experiencing incredible levels of discrimination and racism at that point in time. And then I'm not going to go into it, but there's a whole process of transition, of changing community-based AIDS groups into AIDS service organizations, the replication of corporate forms of organization, executive directors, boards of directors dominated by middle-class professional people, organization around state funding, which means that a large part of the work that many of you have to do in this room is actually reports and documents to get more state funding and to maintain the funding that you have. That actually leads to the total transformation of what you're actually involved in. It's no longer what community-based AIDS groups were supposed to be about. Just give you one example. One of the things I helped to do with ACT was actually investigate the question of incorporation. And the staff actually proposed dual-level incorporation, some sort of like body that would be able to get charitable funds and then ACT itself. The board rejected that, said, oh no, there's not going to be any problems with political advocacy and activism. We'll continue to maintain it. Within 3 months, people were using that they had charitable tax status to refuse to support pro-choice demonstrations, right? So you begin to see this dynamic of the transformation of organizations through these very concrete means. Now, the second wave of AIDS activism, and I'm not going to address in as much detail, has to do with the self-organization and self-empowerment of people living with AIDS and HIV, which starts in Vancouver with the Vancouver PWA Coalition, continues with the inspirations that come from the United States with the emergence of ACT UP groups, the AIDS Coalitions to Unleash Power, which emerge out of this contradiction between people knowing that they could live longer, that there were treatments, there were possibility of survival, but governments and drug companies and the medical profession were denying that. It led to an explosive form of activism that was based on the politicization and radicalization of the anger and rage that people were experiencing. And in Toronto, that took the form of AIDS Action Now, which was formed in late '87, but actually became a public organization in 1988 that was involved in actions in protest against the aerosolized pentamidine trial, where we actually took wooden coffins to symbolize the number of people that were going to die under the double-blind placebo-controlled trial that was being engaged in around aerosolized pentamidine, and we challenged the way in which trials and research was being done. We also engaged in forms of treatment activism where we got people into their bodies. We got drugs like aerosolized pentamidine as a major prophylactic for pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. The picture here is actually people taking unauthorized AIDS treatments on Parliament Hill. And we really pushed, AIDS Action Now really pushed on the question of treatment access and treatment information, and it's one of the reasons why that was actually the most significant and in some ways the only major victory in the first national AIDS strategy. We also realized that drug companies were a big problem, and we engaged in an action to try to get Bristol Myers to release DDI to people who could not take AZT because they found it too toxic on their bodies. We engaged in a blockade of, and again, I'm sorry these images aren't turning out very well here, of the office of Bristol Myers. That's Stephen Maynard, who's actually was one of the people who was arrested then. But 7 of us were arrested for blockading the office of Bristol Myers here at Bay and Queen in Toronto. It was the first actual civil disobedience direct action I'd ever engaged in my life, so I learned an awful lot from it, both the mistakes we made as well as the success that we achieved at that particular event. But we did that simultaneously with a media conference at City Hall, which then produced this demonstration that was held outside where Bristol Myers is. And somehow Brent Southern, who was actually arrested with me, is in that picture there, so this must be actually after he was liberated from the police on that particular occasion. George Smith, who was a very leading person within AIDS Action Now then, said that we needed documents and demonstrations, that we needed to have really good analysis, but we needed to have those backed up by direct action and demonstrations, because otherwise people in positions of power wouldn't have any reason to listen to us at all. And through that strategy, we were actually pretty successful in getting more access to drugs and treatments, not always for people to be able to pay for them, but more formal access for drugs and treatments. We also, along with Reaction SIDA in Montreal and ACT UP New York, took over the opening session of the Montreal AIDS Conference in '89, and that's Tim McCaskill, who's here in the room, opening the AIDS conference on behalf of people living with AIDS and HIV after we stormed and took over the front podium at that conference. We also protested against Brian Mulroney there with a banner that I helped to hold up called Mulroney, you have left us to die, and we did transform the character of those types of conferences. Now, all the time during this period, there's a broadening out of activism that starts largely within white, gay, and to some extent lesbian communities, and broadens out to include other questions of racialization, gender, and class. Alliances with sex workers, work around injection drug users, with alliances with hemophiliacs, work around prison issues, and around social assistance and paying for drugs. We achieved a lot through both the emergence of those community-based AIDS groups as well as the emergence of a more treatment-based AIDS activism. And I think it's really important for us to remember how we changed the world, how we actually changed the response to AIDS and HIV through our own actions and through our own agency. That's something we have to remember and we have to build on. And I won't go into this point because Alex already did it, but I think it's really important for us to remember that one of the ways they rule over us and manage our lives is through the social organization of forgetting. We no longer remember those struggles. We no longer remember that we actually changed the world, that we made it better, that we made it different for people living with AIDS and HIV. That's a capacity we still have that we can still act on. So the resistance of remembering is really important in that context. That we were able to show that direct action in some major ways actually literally does mean that people can live longer in terms of their lives. But it also means for those of us now who are involved in AIDS service organizations that we actually have to resist the forms of bureaucratization and professionalization that have actually transformed those groups. I mean, when I was a member of the AIDS Committee of Toronto in 1983, it was a very, very different type of organization than what exists now. Now, obviously, there's been massive expansion, massive state funding, but these organizations that came out of the grassroots, that came out of community mobilizations, have actually become highly regulated and highly contained, so that many of them, and again, this is not a critique of individuals who work in AIDS service organizations, many of them are experienced by people living with AIDS and HIV as policing regulatory agencies that stand over and against their lives. They're not seen as instruments for liberation and empowerment anymore. So there's something that we have to begin to do. There's questions about whether people should accept state funding. Obviously, groups like AIDS Action Now have always rejected taking state funding because of all of the ties and restrictions that come from that. But we also have to talk about, there are things we need state funding for unless we're going to start to rob banks, which I'm not going to suggest is a credible strategy for AIDS service organizations at this current moment. But taking state funding, being able to use those resources without accepting the constraints that are imposed on people is a very difficult struggle to navigate and to negotiate, but it's one that actually has to be put front and center once again. How to get the resources that we need to meet people's needs, but maintain a commitment to grassroots activism and grassroots organizing, accountability to grassroots movements and organizing. And this is a problem because most AIDS service organizations now are not membership-based organizations in any way, shape, or form. They're executive director, board-driven, sometimes staff-driven organizations that actually have very little contact with people in the communities. Now, there are some that have a different character, and I think that opens up some possibilities for transforming what AIDS service organizations have become. It also means resisting strategies that actually on the surface sound really good, like who wants to be opposed to consultation? Who wants to be opposed to partnership, right? These are really nice, fuzzy, wonderful sounding words, but they're actually central strategies of how neoliberalism rules us. They get us ensnared in strategies of consultation whereby they don't listen to our voices, they listen to the voices of other people who are far more socially powerful than us, and they engage us in endless rounds of consultation and partnership that sap our energies and resources and don't actually allow us to meet the needs and concerns of people who most need them. So this is the dilemma that I'm sort of going to leave you with. Drawing upon insights from the past, can we once again bring together that sort of powerful AIDS activism and use that to transform AIDS service organizations and our social response to AIDS? My suggestion is that we need to operate simultaneously within the existing setup that we have, against it, and that's sometimes really difficult, within and against, but we also have to push constantly beyond the set of restrictions and relationships that have been imposed on us. It's only by that sort of direction, that perspective, that we can actually begin to fundamentally change things. That formulation, by the way, of within, against, and beyond comes from a Marxist theorist by the name of John Holloway. If people are interested in his work, I can talk about that later on. Central to this is addressing questions of class. I think the AIDS movement has really, in some ways, failed. AIDS service organizations have really failed in the sense of addressing questions of class. I'm an anti-poverty activist. It really pains me that AIDS groups aren't there on the front lines, fighting for people living in poverty, people living in disability. It's a real shame. In Sudbury, like the Access will not touch this with a 1,000-foot pole, right? AIDS groups have to come out and speak out against state policies that are hurting all people living in poverty, including people living in poverty who have AIDS and HIV, and so far those voices have largely been silent, aside from groups like AIDS Action Now. And we also have to develop a critical approach to state relations. They might give us funding. It might be useful. They're not our friends. They're not our allies. These are people who are trying to manage and contain our social responses, and we have to remember that. Thank you very much.